Okay, go ahead.
Got it. Okay, let's see if this will advance. It's going to be that way. Okay. Here we are. Okay. Seattle's adaptable urban Cooper's hawks. 3 parts of this talk: a short introduction, an overview of the annual life cycle of the Cooper's hawk, and our study results. My background, as Vic said, I had a 34-year career as a physical therapist, which supported my bird habit. I had the great opportunity to volunteer in the Goshen Mountains in 1993 for 5 weeks, trapping and banding southbound migrants for 60 hours a week for 5 weeks. So I got pretty good. And then I volunteered at a number of other sites in the US. I've been with the Seattle Peregrine Project since the first nest in Seattle, and volunteered with Bud Anderson up in the San Juan Islands to study and band nestlings in cliff nests in the San Juans. And that was a nice way to watch the population recover from DDT. Right now, we've got 3 banding studies outlined there. And let's see if this will, oh, okay, now it'll work. No. Okay, Arthur Cleveland Bent in 1937 didn't have anything nice to say about the Cooper's hawk. And people don't write like this anymore, unfortunately. If the sharpshin is a bloodthirsty villain, this larger edition of feathered ferocity is a worse villain, for its greater size and strength enable it to do more damage. It is the chicken hawk, so cordially hated by poultry farmers, and is the principal cause of the widespread antipathy toward hawks in general. A great story. Cooper's hawks are widely distributed in North America. They're the middle sized of the 3 North American accipiters, as you all know. Sharpshin and northern goshawks are the other 2 accipiters. Now here's your trivia for tonight, so you'll win the bird trivia prize someday. Cooper's hawks were named in 1828 by the French naturalist Charles Lucien Bonaparte, who was Napoleon's nephew. And he came and lived in the US as a naturalist for many years. He is the Bonaparte of Bonaparte's gull. He named the Cooper's hawk after William Cooper, who was a founder of the New York Academy of Sciences. He also named the Wilson's storm petrel after Alexander Wilson. And he coined the genus Zenaida, Z-E-N-A-I-D-A, for mourning dove and white-winged dove, and Zenaida was his wife's name. So, a juvenile male sharpshin hawk on the left, 98 grams of fury, and a juvenile male northern goshawk, 700 grams of fury on the right. And then the bird that would be in the middle is the Cooper's hawk. This is an eastern Cooper's hawk, very pale. This is in Cape May, New Jersey. And the back. And a much darker and much bigger female in Seattle. For those of you who have read Pete Dunne, you know he has his tongue firmly planted in cheek on a lot of things he writes, and this is no different. I'll let you just read that quickly, that little quote from Hawks in Flight. An accipiter ID indeed is not easy. I call this next article, this is a scientific publication that came out of Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, Alan Fish and Josh Hull and associates. This was an accipiter ID study, and at Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, they do both counts of flybys and they trap and band. So what they did is they tested the ID skills of their experienced observers and released 940 juvenile accipiters. And they would release them out of sight so you couldn't judge size, to the human releasing the bird. And so these are experienced observers doing hawk count, ID counts, and their results, 23% of the male Cooper's hawks were misidentified as female sharpshins. So if the really good hawk watchers can't get it right, what hope do the rest of us have? And sharpshin versus coop is a really tough one. And sometimes it's really not fair, but you can still have something like this. Some friends of mine caught this bird in North Carolina in 2008. Any guesses? Goshawk, Cooper's hawk hybrid, natural. It's Cooper's hawk size, but with goshawk coloring, except for the brown wash. A pure goshawk would be silver gray, and this bird is brown. And 2-3 years ago at Cape May in the fall migration, they caught a juvenile hybrid, which is really a tough one. I don't know if I would have even gotten that one in the hand and gotten it right. So Cooper's hawks nesting in cities really started about 40 years ago. They were in the city in very, very small numbers. There was a falconer that Bud Anderson knew in West Seattle who knew of a nest in the big West Duwamish Greenbelt in the 60s. And Frank Beebe, the falconer up in Victoria, BC, knew of a nest of Cooper's hawks in the city in the 50s and 60s. But the real colonization started much later. Part of that is we stopped shooting them, and they had to gradually overcome 300 years of being shot as chicken hawks and adapt to living in fragmented habitat instead of forest. People often ask, were they always here and you're just getting better at finding them? Or is this a new phenomena? Well, the best documentation that it's a new phenomena came out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's some biologists were doing structured route surveys looking for red-tailed hawk and great horned owl nests. And for the first 5 years of their survey, they didn't see any Cooper's hawk nests. And then they got one in 1993, and they tracked the annual growth of the population up to over 40 nests. And I think it's up over 60 by now. So one part of the story, if you've all read John Marslo's wonderful book, Adapters and Avoiders of Human Altered Landscapes, and Cooper's hawks is one of several raptors that have decided that they can make peace with humans and make a good living. Europe has two accipiters, the sparrowhawk and the goshawk, and the goshawks are the ones that are colonizing urban habitats in Europe. There are over 100 pairs of nesting goshawks in the city of Berlin, a similar total in Hamburg. I would love to go see urban nesting goshawks. I would love to have urban nesting goshawks in Seattle, for that matter. It would make my Cooper's hawk study much easier because they eat half of the Cooper's hawks. Well, here is a juvenile female northern goshawk that hit a window in Lake Forest Park about 6 years ago. So they're around in very small numbers and they stray into the city. I don't recommend baby cradle hold for a goshawk. This bird was really stunned, but did clear later and flew off. Likewise, urban nesting sharpshins are exceedingly rare. I know of no nests in the city of Seattle in my birding career. This was about 3 miles north of the Seattle city limits in 2013 and 2014. One reason sharpshins are so rare in the city is that they're on the menu. This is a photo from Edmonds, Washington, a few years ago of an adult Cooper's hawk killing a juvenile sharp-shinned hawk, complete with blood spurt. So our Cooper's Hawk study was founded 2003 by Jack Bettesworth, who was another protege of Bud Anderson, all volunteers, self-funded. The story on how this started was that the Woodland Park Zoo has a falconry flight program. They educate people on birds of prey. And they were flying their kestrel one day, and a Cooper's Hawk came out of the woods, nailed the kestrel, and kept on going. And the Raptor keepers knew Jack, and they contacted him, and he found a Cooper's Hawk nest hidden in the zoo grounds. And from that, he developed a study, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 nests as the years went by. In some cities, there are long-term studies. The Victoria study is shut down. Andy Stewart retired, but certainly Albuquerque still going strong. Was Milwaukee and Stevens Point, Wisconsin, Bob Rosenfield. Brian Millsap, great job in Albuquerque. So typical urban juvenile Cooper's Hawk on the canopy of a truck or a hood ornament. So we'll run through the annual cycle. And as you all know, courtship and nest building, that's what's going on right now. Egg laying and incubation is just starting. We have 2 nests incubating already this year. Hatching and growth, fledging and dependent phase, dispersal and home range establishment. So courtship and nest building drags on for quite a number of weeks. They'll often build 1 nest. I've had them build up to 4, of which I found the other 3, and I didn't find the one they used until December, when the trees lost their leaves. Both sexes will help build the nest. If you want to find Cooper's Hawks, you got to get out of bed. They're most vocal 20 minutes, 30 minutes before and after sunrise. So we did intensive surveys before the trees leaf out. I tallied up one year, we did over 600 site visits before May 1st. Dawn is the best time to find them. So if I looked at the hour around dawn, my success rate was 71%. Non-dawn, 27%. 50 of the 70 detections of birds where I heard the calls first. So urban noise pollution is really a problem. Like the green belts along I-5, it's really hopeless to search in there because you can't hear a thing. So we do spring surveys before the trees leaf out. So here's a typical Cooper's Hawk nest on a major trunk of a big leaf maple. That nest fledged 5 that year. Another nest hidden in a big leaf maple on private property. A huge madrona tree with a nest hidden in the top. They love to be about 15 or 20 feet down from the crown near the center of the tree, except sometimes they don't read the book and they're on a low lateral branch in a cottonwood. And just to prove it wasn't a fluke, they used that nest 2 years in a row. Sometimes you get a nice hint, is it a crow or a Cooper's Hawk nest? Well, there's a Cooper's Hawk perched there, so that helps. This is what we're looking for this time of year before the trees leaf out, is a pair. Here's a female and a male, just sitting, passing the time. And you're waiting to hope that they'll launch into some courtship behavior and start nest building and show you where their nest is going to be. Of course, like this week, it's 38 degrees and you're standing out there shivering, hoping that they'll get on with it. Here's another example. Here's the pair of birds just sitting in a dense maple cluster. So a vocabulary word I learned from Bud Anderson, woofed. So you're watching these birds and you just glance away for a split second and poof, they're gone and you can't find them anywhere. And there's your typical usage. Cooper's Hawks are what I call the ninja assassins of the hawk world. They're the most common hawk in the city of Seattle and often the least seen. They make a living by not being seen. They're perch and scan, ambush, quick pursuit hunting specialists. I did a calculation last August, assuming everybody lived through the breeding season, we had 120 adults and 192 fledglings. So well over 300 Cooper's hawks in the city last August. So here's an adult male Cooper's hawk in spring courtship. Both sexes will flare out their white undertail coverts in courtship. And your best field mark for a male versus female, he's got a purple band on his left leg. That's your best male versus female field mark. The females are almost twice as big as the males. One of the largest differences in raptors. They are monogamous, but they often cheat. So here's male, female, much bigger. So size is your best bet when you've got two birds perched like this, male versus female. What's a very difficult field mark, the male's barring, these adults, the male barring is much finer than the female's coarser barring. But that's, I don't like that field mark very much. It doesn't help me much. What does help me a lot, the males usually have gray here behind the eye, and the females have buff. So that works really nicely for about 90% of your adult Cooper's hawks. Juveniles, you're out of luck. You just got to use size. Oh, yes, let's go back one. Normal size pupils. Next one is the male delivering food to the female, and she's rushing him, and he's so bug-eyed because he's not sure if she's coming for the little chickadee he's got in his talon or for him. So food is delivered, mating occurs, and then right after mating, they launch into nest building. Egg laying is starting right now. As I said, we've got two nests on incubating eggs now. The female will stop hunting while she's laying. She'll stay near the nest usually, and she'll lay 4 or 5 eggs about every 2 days. Each egg is individually fertilized, which is where the mischief comes from. So there's a potential for extra pair copulations. Both birds will contribute to incubation. It'll be 5 weeks. Male continues to do all the hunting. If there's an early failure, they may re-nest. We've had 3 nests collapse and break the eggs. And 2 of the 3, they built a new nest, started over, and succeeded. So Bob Rosenfield in Wisconsin sent me this picture. This is a record clutch of 8 chicks in a single Cooper's hawk nest. And they took DNA from them and verified that they're all from one set of parents. So it's not 2 females laying 4 eggs each. So Bob did a wonderful study they published in 2015. They climbed trees in Wisconsin and took blood samples from 140 chicks, and then trapped and took blood samples from the parents and tried to match the DNA. Well, 19.3% of the chicks were fathered by somebody else. So you see something like that and you think about, the female's sitting in the nest and the male's off hunting. Well, it's the male that goes and visits the neighbor and leaves a little DNA behind. At least that's what you would assume. But then we looked at this study by Brian Millsap. This was telemetry work in Florida on Cooper's hawks. So most of these birds weren't observed, but the telemetry signal was collected. So these are male, these clear circles are male territories. And this hatched marker is the movements of one female before she settled into incubation. So she visited 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different males' territories. We don't know if she visited with the males or just visited the territories. So Brian, in his conclusion, was that they're assessing the neighboring males and their territories so that maybe next year they'll move to a better territory or a better male. So what we found out, mainly through Jack Bettisworth's work, we published in 2017, was it's the females that are moving. So Jack and his band of volunteers had a nest in the Arboretum in Seattle and a nest in Volunteer Park. And they watched this female go back and forth between the two males. She was a banded female from Victoria, so there was only one like her, and they could read the code on her band with a scope. They had 15 days where she mated with both the males. She mated with the male in the Arboretum the day before she settled on eggs in Volunteer Park. So we had a second observation of that in 2015, where a banded female was going back and forth between two males. And we have that going on right now between the Montlake Phil and Laurelhurst Playfield, where the female is moving back and forth between two males. And we're waiting to see which male she chooses. So Bob Rosenfield felt that they're seeking extra feedings from the neighboring males to help with the high energy demands of egg formation. These eggs are almost 10% of their body weight, and they lay 4 or 5 of them. So just before they lay, they go into what's called egg lethargy, and they'll just stand here for like a half an hour and not move. It's like they're hypnotized in a trance. And you'll see this on several visits as they're laying their clutch. And then what you'll see is just the tip of a tail sticking over the side of the stick nest. So it's an asynchronous hatch. They'll hatch in the order laid, so you can have a spread of ages in a nest. They go from an egg to adult in 5 weeks. The male continues to hunt for everybody. So he's feeding himself, his spouse, and 4 or 5 kids. So the male has to be a really good hunter and a good provider. Here's a nest with 4 young. This nest was at a Madrona, and the female had brought in some cedar sprigs for deodorant or insect repellent or whatever. And then a few days later, the earliest to hatch is almost as big as the other 3. As the kids get bigger, the female sits higher and higher, brooding in the nest. And at some point, they're too big to brood, and she'll just sit with them. And then they get so big and obnoxious, she leaves and hides in a perch where she can keep an eye on things, but they can't see her. They can get kind of crowded. They'll start branching at about 4 weeks of age, and they'll fledge at 5 weeks, usually late June to mid-August. They're still dependent on their parents for food, but something clicks in their head about 2 to 3 weeks after they fledge, and they'll start chasing everything, each other, inappropriate things like great blue herons, or just to practice their hunting skills. I watched one juvenile chasing a thrush, making the food begging noise, like, hey, come here, come here. So here's a teenage hoodlum gang. They're very curious. They'll wander the neighborhood together. One will fly like 3 houses over and land on the roof, and then the other 3 will follow, and they'll run around the roof. These 2 girls were playing King of the Mountain, taking turns bumping each other off the cedar tree. How do I know they're girls? They have orange bands on their right leg. And what's kind of sweet is for a few weeks after they fledge, they still lie down on branches like they're a little chick in the nest. So juveniles will disperse in 5 to 7 weeks after they fledge. It takes just that short amount of time for them to learn how to hunt and take off. Females disperse further than males, and a third are dead within 6 months. Let's see. So here's a determined young male right at 6 weeks post-fledge. He came out of a nest on Capitol Hill, and this photograph was taken in a yard in Edmonds. So he was on a mission to go somewhere. I just love that photo. It was an action shot. It was raining that day. And there's no doubt who he is. 8/4, purple left, sorry. So the first nesting attempt for males will be when they're 2 years old. Most females, and this is contentious, but it's much less contentious now. Females usually nest when they're 1 year old. Males are extremely rare. And a high percentage of 1 year old females who are still in juvenile plumage, if they're breeding, it's said to be indicative of a rapidly expanding population or high adult mortality. So my summary of the Seattle data, almost 25% of our breeding females are still in juvenile plumage, 1 year old. Brian Millsap in Albuquerque, similar number. Bill Stout in Milwaukee, again, similar numbers. So a lot of 1 year old females. Again, adult male, deep red eye, female still in juvenile plumage. They look like two different species. Pale orange eye for a 1 year old female. So Brian Millsap, who's a great guy and a real inspiration, late 50s, early 60s, he went back to college and got his PhD in raptor biology. He is the director of the Raptor program for U.S. Fish and Wildlife nationally. So for his PhD research, he put VHF transmitters on 80 juvenile females. 60% are dead in the first year. If they live to be 1 year old, they nested. Contrast that to 1 year old males. Bob Rosenfield's huge data set, 13 1 year old males out of 732 nesting attempts. Here in Seattle, we've had 19 1 year old males out of 330 nesting attempts. So there's something about being a 1 year old male is you're just not competent enough to hold a territory and to hunt sufficiently to feed a family. So what are they eating? Mostly things that you want eaten: starlings, house sparrows, rock pigeons, rats, and bunnies. They'll also take whatever's common: robins, flickers. Victoria, BC did a great study. 50% of the prey base was starling and house sparrows. If you throw in robins, you got 85% of the prey base. The other 15% is a long list of mammals and birds. So these industrial feeder operations draw Cooper's hawks. Although the one study that looked at bird feeders was by Tim Roth in Indiana, and they radio tracked wintering accipiters, both Sharpies and Coops. They said there's no systematic use of bird feeders, which leaves me scratching my head. They visited feeders no more frequently than other portions of the habitat. And I love this quote: feeders are locations where humans are more likely to observe hawk attacks, not where hawks are most likely to hunt. I would love to duplicate this study someday if I live forever. Here's my favorite male, rest in peace. He fledged 17 kids over 4 years. That's one of the first Cooper's hawks I banded in this study. There's a 280-gram male Cooper's hawk taking down a 350-gram pigeon. And he's glaring at the photographer because he knows the pigeon's too heavy for him to fly off with it. So he's got to wait for the photographer to back off, and then he'll dress it and then haul it back to feed his kids. The bigger females will take bunnies. I would suspect this is a recently fledged female because for the first few weeks after they fledge, they have this cream in their bib, and that fades very fast. And I would be surprised if she was competent enough to kill a bunny at that age. So I think that that was brought in by a parent, but she's nicely mantling it so her siblings don't see her food. I think dietary flexibility is one thing that helps Cooper's hawks be successful in all sorts of different urban habitats. Up here, it's a mix of birds, rats, and rabbits. In the Southwest, they're taking doves, and more doves because of all the other dove species we have in the southern US. In Wisconsin, it's chipmunks and more chipmunks. There was a pioneering study done on Cooper's hawk prey delivery to 5 nests on Lopez Island in the 1980s, and California quail was their most common prey at the time. Yes, bunnies and a Drake mallard in the Arboretum, or sorry, Drake wood duck. Okay, so this is mostly a happy talk. Cooper's hawks are thriving, their numbers keep increasing. I have 2 short depressing sections, and this is the first part. So it's not all rosy living in the city. Window hits take an awful toll. They can get trichomonas from pigeons, particularly in the Southwest where there's more doves in their diet, they get trichomonas. Anticoagulants and other rodenticide, rat poison kills more than rats. And they're in the middle on the food chain in urban predators. So raccoons, large owls, eagles, hawks, falcons, egg thieves, all can hit Cooper's hawks. So here's a fresh window hit, a juvenile male with a full crop, and the property owner just found this out on his patio. Here's an adult with a prey item that has a long tail. So anticoagulant rodenticides, they're blood thinners, developed in the 1940s. Here's your other piece of trivia. Warfarin was the original blood thinner. Wisconsin Alumni Research Fund, Warfarin. The second generation anticoagulants were developed in the 1970s. These are super warfarins. The nastiest of the bunch is brodifacoum. They're slow acting, highly lethal, and highly persistent. The half-life of brodifacoum in the liver of a rat is 305 days. So California, as always, leads the country in some things. And they did a lot of testing for exposure to rat poison, anticoagulant rat poisons. And this is their positive exposure rates. And they also tested mammals, which is very depressing. 28 out of 28 mountain lions tested positive for rat poison. And the anticoagulants are linked to fatal cases of mange in big cats and immune suppression in bobcats. So we saw all this information and we said, what can we do? Nobody's ever looked in Washington. So we formed a nonprofit, Urban Raptor Conservancy, and forged a cooperative agreement with the veterinarians and staff at PAWS to establish a baseline level of rodenticide exposure in Washington. So we have tested 125 raptors, hawks, and owls. And while we were working on this study, somebody else published a study on Washington. And this was part of the experimental culling of barred owls out of spotted owl habitat. And when you have some dead barred owls, you might as well make more use of them and test them for rodenticides. So the area around Cle Elum, they tested 14 owls for anticoagulants and 9 of them tested positive. Trace levels for brodifacoum, but this is a forest, national forest habitat outside Cle Elum. So this stuff is everywhere. So what we found in our first study was almost all of the hawks and owls from the Seattle area test positive for exposure. So 34 of 38 Cooper's hawks were positive. 21 of our Cooper's hawks tested positive for 3 different anticoagulants. And 4 tested positive for 4 different anticoagulants. So there's a tough question of what's exposed and what's poisoned. What's a safe level? That's a topic for a whole nother talk. So our results on this part 1 are going to be published hopefully later this year. We really appreciate the grants and donations from Patagonia, Peter Mason's Family Charitable Trust, Seattle Audubon, Connie Seidels is a Force of Nature, and a lot of individuals. We started part 2 underway. We got pause, actually got extra permitting to allow to test bald eagles to be tested. And some really good toxicologists in Vancouver, BC, John Elliott and Sophie Heinmarch, published some results where peregrines were showing exposure to anticoagulants. And we had specifically excluded peregrines from our study. It's like, they eat other birds. They're not going to have rat poison. Well, so now we are including in our second, so we're going to do 75 more. And we're going to test some bald eagles and some peregrines. And we're also adding testing for the neurotoxin bromethylene, which is one of 2 things that's often used as a substitute for the anticoagulants. The other being vitamin D cholecalciferol, which is a vitamin D poisoning, essentially, but it's very difficult to test for. So, okay, Seattle study results, almost done here. We had 3 main goals. We wanted to find all the nests in the city and measure density. Well, that's a fool's errand in 84 square miles. Verify the number of fledglings and measuring productivity. We did a pretty good job of that. And color ID band as many adults and fledglings as we can, and see what that tells us. So last year, we had 69 nest building pairs, basically 84 square miles in Seattle. So we had a pair of Cooper socks every 1.2 square miles. But we've had nests as close as 330 meters apart, and some areas are not safe or inaccessible to search. So we're certainly missing some. When people try and pin me down, how many do you think you're missing? I'll go, well, 5, maybe 10, but not many more than that. So where did they nest? 69 nest building pairs. They love the Seattle Park system. Private residences, cemeteries, state of Washington, and a National Guard armory this year. That was a new one. This year, we already have 43 pairs pinned down with 2 of them incubating. So I assume that we'll at least equal that 69 or a few more this year, although it's been slow because it's been so cold for so long. The Cooper Sox love the Olmsted brothers, who did a very nice parks plan for the city of Seattle in 1903, and then several more iterations of that plan, as well as the UW for the 1909 Alaska Yukon Expedition. Drumheller Fountain is a remnant of the Olmsted plan. All of these red circles represent Cooper's hawk nests, and almost all of them are Olmsted parks. So what do they like? A range of habitats. Dense forest, second growth, third growth Doug fir, way up in the Doug fir. They love these mosaic parks with lots of edge habitat, a mix of lawns and clusters of trees. So there's a big leaf maple nest there. University of Washington campus parking lot. There's a nest up in this white pine. And another Seattle park up in a sycamore. And private yards, mostly in northeast and far northwest Seattle, where every yard has 3 or 4 Doug firs that are about 80 years old in it, and a couple of big leaf maples and a cedar, and they can be anywhere. So again, here's that big leaf maple nest. There's another big leaf maple nest. What tree species do they like? Whatever they feel like. So here's the list from last year. And this holds up over the whole 10 years. Big leaf maple is the most popular, Doug fir second, then Madrona white pine, and then anything else that they choose. We had a tulip last year for the first time. We've got another eucalyptus going right now this year. So most of the birds, about 80% of them will build a new nest every year, and the other 20% will reuse the same nest. So I looked at 1 year, reoccupancy was about 78% of the territories were reoccupied. 81% of those birds built a new nest, and 6 pairs used the same nest. We had one banded female use the same nest for 9 years, and in the spring of her 10th year, she got hit by a car. And she had had 37 kids. She was banded, so we knew who she was. And productivity. So if a nest succeeds in producing young, it's between 3 and 4, so 3.59 fledged young per pair. If we look at productivity by age of the female, so adult females, 3.73 young per successful nest. 1-year-old females still in juvenile plumage, 3.42. So they're a little less productive, but not much. So you figure if you've got 50 successful nests and they're putting out 3.4, 3.5, 3.6 young, that's a lot of Cooper's hawks every year. So even if you have 60% mortality in the first year, you still got a lot of Cooper's hawks. So typical attrition, actually this attrition is much worse than typical last year. We started with 69. 8 of them didn't even get to incubation. 4 of them failed during incubation. 57 pairs hatched. 5 failed after the young hatched. We still had 52 pairs with fledged young and 192 fledged young. So last year it was 3.69 young per successful pair. So how's things been going in Seattle? Numbers keep going up every year. Is the population increasing, or are we just getting better at finding them? Yes. So finally, banding. We buy color VID bands from a company in Edmonton, Alberta. And we use ancient traps. These are called balsha trees. They're developed in the Middle East centuries ago. We are only allowed to use non-native species as lures. So this is a house sparrow and a society finch. And these juvenile male Cooper's hawk comes in and looks, and he's just puzzled. Why aren't they flying away from me? And then the house sparrow will go, tick, 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 and he'll flee. So they have to work up the courage to attack. And this is covered with fishing lines, slip knot nooses. So they'll get snared and the trap is too heavy for them to drag off. Excuse me. So we're putting purple bands on the, sorry about that phone. Well, I didn't kill it. Let me kill it. Excuse me, go away. Oh, we put purple bands on the left leg of male. So this would be purple left 0/8. And we put orange bands on the right legs of females. This would be orange right 6/R. And after we band them, we get to pose. This was an interesting male. He was my favorite male for a long time. He came out of a nest in the University of Washington campus, and he nested 300 yards from where he was born. After his parents died, he inherited the UW territory. And after a couple of highly successful years, he hit a window up in the fraternity area and bad fractures and went to pause and had to be euthanized. We tested him for rat poison, and he had 4 different rat poisons on board. I drew a 500-meter circle around his nest and searched, and I had 298 of those black bait boxes within 500 meters of his nest. Think that's enough rat poison? And this is my colleague, Martin Muller. Actually, sorry, excuse me. That's my colleague with Urban Raptor Conservancy, Patty Leshy. And my other colleague, Officer Martin Muller. So Martin and I were the two banders for the first 9 years, and then we trained 2 new banders. We've banded 436 Cooper's Hawks in the city. We've had 553 repeat sightings on 193 different birds. Window hits is the most common mortality. We've got almost 500 live sightings where the band's read and photographed. 44% return rate, which is just fantastic. Where are these birds seen? Out of 553 sightings, over 500 in King County, most of them in Seattle. This Island County is an outlier. This is one bird who keeps coming to a backyard bird feeder for the last 7 years. And he comes by a couple of times a week to this feeder operation on Whidbey Island and gets counted over and over again. So we've had 2 sightings south of Tacoma, one in Oakland, California, and one in Nye County, Nevada. She almost made it to Vegas. But most of these birds stay close to home. Our conclusion from our banding program is most urban Cooper's Hawks have abandoned migration, where sightings are year-round. We have a fair number of sightings in January, December, February. They have strong nest site fidelity. If they live through the year, they'll be back to the same territory, maybe 100 yards away from last year's nest. Also, the strong wintering site fidelity. We had a banded male who for 10 years commuted between his summer nest near Sandpoint Golf Course and wintering in Magnuson Park. And short natal dispersal distances. Most of these birds go a mile or 3 or 4 from where they were born to nest. Females, again, further. Both of those out-of-state birds were females. And the wonderful thing about the proliferation of good cameras is people send us pictures like this. 0 over P. This bird's out in somebody's backyard and they track us down with the picture. Sometimes you have to wait for them to stretch to show the band. Sometimes they're feeding, so they're exposed the band nicely for a photograph. This was a fun bird. Female orange right 6 over Z. I banded her about 8 hours before this picture was taken, about 150 yards away. And she showed up at this water feature in the backyard and was photographed. Well, about a month later, when she started dispersing, she stumbled down onto SeaTac Airport. And they don't like hawks at SeaTac Airport. Bud Anderson is the lead trapper there. And they trapped her away from the runway and gave her a one-way ticket to Skagit Flats. So Bud released her in Skagit Flats. And then 2 years later, she turns up as an adult in Anacortes. And speaking of wonderful cameras, how about this? And this is somebody shooting a wild bird out their window. Just a great photograph and no doubt who that is. So one thing that keeps me at this is, when are we going to hit carrying capacity? You know, how many more Cooper's Hawks can we pack into this city? We're getting an answer on how do Cooper's Hawks and barred owls partition the habitat. Some of them get along, and then we've had 2 Cooper's Hawks pairs get booted out of their nesting territory by barred owls. And the second depressing part of this talk is, how will climate change affect urban raptors? So short depressing talk and then more happy stuff. Okay, come on. So that heat wave in late June last year, these were 3 Cooper's Hawk chicks that got so hot in the nest they jumped, and they had no feathers, so they flew like rocks and died. So we had not known of this nest, and we got the report of these dead chicks, went back, and there was still one in the nest. So one had not jumped and lived to fledge. It was an awful time, those 3 hot days. Paws Wildlife Center was tearing their hair out. They had a full house. They had 12 Cooper's Hawk jumpers, 9 bald eagle jumpers, 2 merlins, a sharpshin, among the raptors. And we were able to band all of those birds and release them all back out. For some of these birds, well, to release them, we had to find their nests, and we had to find that their parents were still there and feeding them. And if that was not occurring, we couldn't release them because they couldn't hunt for themselves yet. So we did an experiment, and we fostered 2 of these where we couldn't find the nest. We fostered them in with other pairs of Cooper's Hawks that had like 1 or 2 chicks, because normally they're feeding 3, 4, 5 kids. So we thought it was no extra burden to add 1 extra mouth to somebody who's feeding 2, or in the other case, the 1 that didn't jump from those other 3 that died. And we thought we had it bad when Seattle hit 102, 104, and 108, but Portland hit 116. Portland's Audubon Wildlife Center took in 110 Cooper's Hawk chicks in 4 days. They were able to release over 2/3 of those back to their parents. So hopefully that's a once in a century heat wave, but who knows? That was pretty awful. So, great book. If you want to learn more about Cooper's Hawks, Bob Rosenfield is Mr. Cooper's Hawk. He's been studying them for 40 years. Great guy, very meticulous researcher. And another good book, Urban Raptors, has a good chapter on Cooper's Hawks that I didn't write, but I was a co-author on the Peregrine chapter on this book. And if you pick your field study area carefully, you have lots of good perks. So you can always stay caffeinated in Seattle. And in 2018, I did a big year, and I went to all 56 brew pubs while I was out looking at Cooper's Hawks. And I'm glad I did it then, because now there's 75. I want to thank all the Coop group, because all of this data couldn't be gathered by me. It was a work of many people over the years. And the same for the photographs. There are a lot of photographers who donated their pictures to help me construct this presentation. And of course, no Seattle talk is complete without a Gary Larson cartoon. And if you're short a clothespin, a Cooper's Hawk can help you out, as long as you've got that bird feeder out there. So, questions?
Well, thanks a lot, Ed. That was really great.
Thank you.
If you wanted to stop sharing, maybe we could go ahead and open up the chat and see what questions folks have.
So how do I do that? Let's see.
Very top.
Oh, don't do that. Okay. Oh, stop share up there. Okay.
There you go. Perfect.
All right.
So that was an amazing presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You have some comments in the chat. Once again, if you're interested in asking a question, you could go ahead and type it in the chat. That's probably the easiest way. So Catherine's asking, I'd never heard of egg lethargy before. Wondering what is that common in raptors?
Yeah, you see it. I've certainly seen it a lot in peregrines, like the downtown Seattle peregrine nest that's got a video cam on it. You can really tell when the female is going to lay, because she goes into this torpor. Again, just sitting there, like seemingly in a daze. And I envision that they're just mobilizing all their energy to form an egg. Because they're pulling calcium out of their bones, they're using up their fat reserves. They spent the whole winter building up calcium and building up fat reserves in anticipation of breeding. So they're reversing the metabolism to form an egg.
Great. So there's a couple of questions from Damandina. One is
Oh,
the 1-year-old males, did they just wander around? And then the second question is, can you recommend any types of cameras?
I would refer her to a couple of our photo junkies, Jeff Graham and Larry Gilpin, and for camera, or Martin Muller for camera advice. What do 1-year-old males do? We'd love to know. I think that they do try and settle into a territory and hold a territory, and some of them will try and pull in a female. I've had several 1-year-old males pull in an adult female and court her and build a nest and everything, but then it just doesn't happen. We've had a few 1-year-old males pull it off, fledge young. Another interesting story was Roanoke Park 2 years ago in Capitol Hill. Pair of adults had nested there for several years. Everything's going great in spring. They're courting, they're mating, they're adding to their nest, and then the male vanishes. Don't know what happened to him. And within days, a 1-year-old male came in, and he was raring to go. He's beating up crows. He's hauling sticks to the nest. He's bringing food to her. And then he went to mate, and she just brushed him away with her wing. Like, get out of here, kid. And then they vanished, and there was no nesting in that park since. So yeah, 1-year-old males will try and hold a territory, but they'll also wander, and they'll look for an opening, a vacant territory. Some people say they learn what a good territory is because they get beat up. Other questions?
Bonnie and Kathleen said, hey, they really loved the presentation, fabulous program. Thanks for sharing. And Cheryl has a question about who is studying raptors in Kitsap County. And I was going to ask a similar question because I've been seeing Cooper's hawk with a white band, but it only had one leg band. So I don't know.
Jamie Acker, I sometimes butcher Jamie's name.
Yeah.
He's a real great owl researcher. I don't know anybody who's doing diurnal raptors in Kitsap. If you do have a Cooper's hawk with a single band, the most likely source of that is SeaTac, where they trap and band and release the birds away from the runway, take them up to the Skagit. But it could be a southbound migrant, northbound migrant. They're banding at Golden Gate. We had a adult male Cooper's hawk hit by a car and killed in Kitsap a few years ago, and he had been banded at LAX.
Wow.
So they don't all stop migrating, but some of them do. So, I want to recognize Damadina too. She's one of our volunteers, does a great job tracking several Cooper's hawk nests.
So that's all the questions right now in the chat. Looks like Vic has the question. He has his hand raised.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that presentation. That was fabulous. I mean, all the research and information and your dedication to Cooper's hawks is phenomenal. And I know you went to a bunch of work to put this together. So really want to call you out for what you've done to make this a delightful evening for Kitsap Audubon.
Thank you.
Yeah. A question that you mentioned, was it a nest in Wisconsin that had 8?
Yeah.
8? Did any report on how many of those actually fledged? I mean, that's a full
They
nest.
all fledged.
All of them. Oh,
all of them fledged. Yeah, they were all banded. They all fledged. He published it. There's he published a short report on that.
Wow.
This last year.
So, and we do have another question from Octopus Turtle asking, are domestic cats ever prey?
No. Nope. Too big, too mean. Pigeons are about, pigeon and some ducks are about as big as they'll go for prey, and that'll be a big female coop.
So we've
Yeah,
noticed the Eurasian collared doves, we have a lot of those, and those seem
Oh
to be
yeah,
favorites for the coopers.
them and bandtail pigeons, they love bandtail pigeons, or just plain old pigeons. You'll see them down at the grain terminal in Seattle pretending they're peregrines, trying to snatch pigeons out of the sky. I will tell an anecdote about Bud Anderson. You know, you talked about my dedication to Cooper's Hawks. Bud Anderson asked me a question once. He said, "What's the definition of a masochist?" And he said, "An accipiter biologist." Sorry to interrupt you. Next question. Yeah.
I'll go. Ed, a question. I mean, we've got all kinds of problems with Cooper Hawk interaction on human structures and cars and whatever else and poisons. But in terms of the natural world, what are the top predators of the Cooper's Hawk?
So out in the national forest, I would say tree climbing mammal predators like fishers or martens, and northern goshawks. And goshawks are fierce predators. They'll take anything. And an aside on that, about the colonization of Europe cities by goshawks, they've been hammering the Eurasian kestrels, the sparrowhawks, and the common buzzards population in the cities. So it's like the Cooper's Hawks have discovered a new habitat. They can make a living in the city and their population just takes off. And we'll see where it ends up.
Well, thanks a lot, Ed.
Thank
Looks like
you.
that's all the questions for now. We definitely appreciated the presentation, and
Thank you. Thank you for your interest.
and so we'll go ahead and have the copy of this presentation on our website, and we'll make sure to put a link to your conservancy there, that
Thank you.
the
Yeah.
work that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, if I live forever, I'd love to do a companion study of density in the national forest and see what productivity and what density is in a natural habitat instead of a man-made habitat. So thank you all.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day, and great
Yeah.
weekend.
I think it's happy hour.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine, for filling in for Annie.
Thank you, Vic.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.